All right, we should be shortly streaming live here. Now, let me let all of my folks know. All right. All right, we should be shortly streaming live here. Hey, folks, let me make sure that I'm not going to be feeding back here. All right, looks like we're ready to rock there. All right, gents. I've had one of the students told me here a little while ago he's going to be running a little bit late. He's got some stuff just sort of popped up on him here. First, I want to ask you guys, did you have anything that you encountered last night when you were going with through your homework and the labs? Now, I worked through all those labs myself last night, and I guess the time or whatever it was, but they seemed to work just fine for me. I didn't have any issues at all in navigating through the labs. Did any of you guys experience any issues when you were working through? I got the chat box on here, right? Okay, Chris says the live lab wouldn't load. Okay. Yeah, I would check it. Like I say, I worked through all three of the labs and the PBQ, the performance-based question that I had you guys going through as well. And I didn't encounter any issues whatsoever. I did have a scare this morning. I was setting up class, getting ready to go live with class. And right in the smack dab middle of trying to set everything up in the home studio here, all my power went out. Everything just died. I'm going, okay, well that's not going to be very good here. But it was just short lived. I guess they were doing some kind of reset in the neighborhood or whatever. But so it seems like it all is good right here. Oh, geez, yeah, David, that's a tough there as well. All right, well, gents, let's go ahead and dive on in this thing now. Up until this point, we have been discussing some of the tool suites. We have talked a good little bit of detail specifically on Nmap. Didn't really dive in that much in depth into the Wireshark tool, but one of the labs that you guys went through got pretty deep down into that. Now, Wireshark, of course, as you guys know, is the protocol analysis packet capture tool that allows you to capture the interactions between two endpoints in a network connection, and then do further analysis on those data frames and packets. The Nmap tool is the one that we really are going to use a lot in, especially in the first couple of phases of the penetration test, in doing the reconnaissance steps, the identifying individual systems, identifying the host machines that are out in the network, and the specifics of how they're configured, things like that. Now, that's where I was also telling you yesterday. It's very, very important that you all have a really good, solid understanding of the communication protocols, software protocols, and the default ports that they are designed to operate over. Because not only will that give you valuable information about how the host machines are actually configured, that also gives you lots of good information on if the systems are up, if they're active, and the combination of the different ports and the software protocols that are running over those things tells you a lot of good information about what type of endpoint it may happen to be. Is it a server? Is it a web server? Is it an app server? Is it a domain controller? So you have to have that good, solid baseline of understanding with those communication ports and the particular protocols. Okay. So bear that in mind. And if you don't know what those things are, you're going to have to memorize those. And I told you guys earlier, this class actually assumes that you already have that knowledge base. So be sure to, if you have not already done so, grab those files that I made available to you on the wormhole sites for download there, and that's good study material there. Okay. Now this particular module starts digging a little bit deeper into the actual pen test attack itself, how we actually conduct and get on into it. A couple of the things that we need to identify and worry about when we start setting up and doing the reckon order, the reconnaissance phases, the discovery phases, figuring out what the endpoint systems are. There will come a time when an organization begins to realize that some of their systems are, like me, getting a little long in the tooth and showing their age. They call those end of life systems. Now, there's two actual things that we need to worry about when we're talking about those legacy systems. End of life is one situation, and that means that the manufacturer of the device or the manufacturer of the software, the hardware, whatever it might happen to be, that they have stopped the manufacture process. They're not going to be making any new ones, and they have actually activated, in that sense, what their end of service is going to be. So end of life means that the systems are out of date, out of manufacture. End of service means that the original manufacturer or proprietor of the software, the developer of the software, operating system, whatever, that they have pulled support from it. So those are two very important dates that we need to look for as a systems networking and planning thing. Now, as far as end of life and end of service systems, as the way we pen testers actually look at it, those are very valuable because lots of those things, they're not getting any more updates from the original vendor. They are not being, they don't get any software security patches, things like that. So they oftentimes are very, very vulnerable to certain types of exploits and attack. Okay. Now, we're also going to take a look in this module as well, as far as identifying those systems, as far as figuring out, certain types of attacks that may indeed be effective on the systems. And this is when we begin to weaponize some of the information that we gather when we've done that original reckon order and that reconnaissance function. Okay. That's when we start, pinpointing certain targets and prioritizing those based upon the configuration, as well as based upon how compromising those particular host machines may indeed have those domino effect with other host machines in the network as a whole. We call those high value assets. Things like domain controllers or firewall systems that may sort of open the floodgates and allow access further into a network. Again, those end of life or end of service type of systems that may be extremely vulnerable just by the nature of them being not, basically out of service. So once we identify those specific attack areas, then we begin to pull together the specific pieces of software and script programs and attack tools out there to begin to really, really go after those vulnerable systems there. And always remember now, as a penetration tester, it's very, very important that we constantly maintain good, solid documentation on what we're doing. I mentioned a couple of times already this week what I value in the scripting languages, and I call it my twofer. You use the scripting language, in my case, for documentation purposes, because all the scripting languages, as we looked at yesterday, give us the ability of using comments in line. Well, those comments are my documentation. But in addition to that, I use that scripting language to accomplish one of the very end goals of the exercise, and that's being able to back out everything that I've done and in essence clean up after myself after the pen test is done. My preference on that is using the scripting language because it allows me that automated functionality at the end of the engagement rather than having to read notes, undo this, read notes, undo that. I've got it all documented. I've got it all backed out. So as I was saying, if I put a script file onto a computer system, well, I'll put me a piece of script programming in there to delete that script file. If I have corrupted a file, destroyed a file, well, prior to that, I will have copied that file off, and then I need to copy it back onto the system. If I've moved a file from one location to another, well, I need to move it back. So setting back in place to the same standard that the system was configured in prior to me going in and beginning my attack, that's what I use that script program for. Okay. So when I'm beginning to set the thing up, when I identify the individual targets, I want to make certain that any of the targets that I've identified that are indeed vulnerable and that I may want to launch an attack on, that's when I have to check back on the rules of engagement documentation that define the overall scoping of the project. It told me what systems were on the playing field and what systems were out of bounds altogether. So I want to make certain that once I identify those targets, that I'm not going after something that is completely out of bounds and that is not specifically identified in my rules of engagement documentation. Okay. So now another thing that we'll want to do when we're identifying the targets and then gone through and using some of the tools like the Nmaps and the Wiresharks and TCP dump and some of the other tool suites that we've talked about over the last couple of days. Once I have identified and prioritized those high value assets and assured that they are indeed within the scope of the exercise itself, well, that's where I begin to put together the specific tools. For instance, if I identify a very high value target that happens to be sort of a hub that controls the access from lots of wireless points into a particular network segment. Well, there's very particular software suites and modules that I can use, like the Aircrack NG product line we talked about, to create and launch and attack those wireless access points there. You see, I also want to make certain that I am paying particular attention to any regulations or limitations that regulation may put upon me in the way that I go after data assets. Remember, we talked several times about what I referred to as acronym data: personally identifiable information, professional health information, personal medical information, protected credit information. In every case, those data are protected by some level of regulation. Okay. So I have to make certain that all of my team members understand that, and make certain that if indeed we are going to have any effect at all on the collection, the storage, the sharing, the protection of those data, I got to make certain that I put the guardrails around my attack system so that first and foremost, I'm making certain I have, if I'm going to be attacking any of those data, that I don't allow those data to be exposed out into the wild. Okay, because that may very well be breaking laws, and it may very well point back to me with either criminal or civil liability. Yes, go ahead, Kevin. What's the question, buddy?
Yeah, sure. So when we're talking about setting up these tests and automating everything, I'm assuming like, well, what's the preparation? Is that set up kind of like the typical agile SDL software development life cycle, where we have 2 to 3 weeks before we go in to run these penetration tests against the client, and we would have time to automate the whole process, or do you already have like a template already created and then you just modify it based on the client?
You hit it. The last thing you said there hit it right on the head. It's all situational based on the client. Now, in many cases, you could set up those templates. Now, I mentioned to you earlier in the week, I have approached it in the past with that agile SDLC concept. Like every morning, I would have the stand-up meetings. Every afternoon, I would have the stand-up meetings, and we would discuss what everything at the beginning of the day, what everybody's tasks were, and then at the end of the day, we would discuss anything they discovered that was out of bounds or that seemed out of scope. And we'd collect all the documentation at the end of the day, and I would have my documenters actually forming all those notes down into a structured, readable document that we would use to present at the end of the day. But you hit it right on the head with the last thing you said. Yes, I like working from templates. And if the organizations that you're setting the exercise up for are closely aligned as far as the type of business, the size of the business, networking, and et cetera, um, those templates can certainly serve as a starting place, but you'll have to, as you were saying, customize it for every client, for every organization, and for every engagement that you plan. But yeah, I'm with you. I like working from template structure. Any and everything that can apply, from that template, I will certainly do. But as far as the time frame, I think I told you guys a couple of days ago, most of the engagements that either my company or the company that I worked for were involved with, we would spend 4, 5, 6 times the amount of time just prepping the engagement as it took to actually perform the engagement. So yeah, that planning and prep phase takes a lot more time and effort and resource before you actually begin the engagement. And if indeed you've spent that additional time up front planning it out, then the engagement should flow much more smoothly. But, Murphy's Law, and every time you get in and start doing these things, you're going to encounter something that is sort of a hiccup. But just remember what I've told you several times along the way. Each individual team member, their job is to stay on task as much as humanly possible. And anything that pops up that's sort of out of bounds or seen maybe out of scope, the supervisor's got to handle that. So, but very good question, sir. And again, you answered pretty much your own question with the last statement that you made there about it being situational for sure. Okay. You will encounter just about every case when you start doing these engagements. You will encounter some information, some systems that is protected. You know, organizations, intellectual property that organizations own. And I'm talking about design specifications, trademarks, copyrights. Any of that is intellectual property and protected information. And that also lends to what I've said a couple of times as well, making certain that while we are performing this engagement, we have to be really, really concerned about controlling the data being released into the wild. Because as I said, when you do the vulnerability assessment, you are laying bare where the vulnerabilities are in the organization. That is very valuable information to the thieves, thugs, and malcontents out there if they are planning an attack on that particular environment. Okay. Now, the CISA organization, I don't believe I've given you guys the link to their website. I'll give that to you right now. They publish some very good information about doing these types of engagements here. Now, of course, this is a government type of agency, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. These guys right here, they have lots of good information, especially about protecting high value assets and high value information inside just about every kind of organization. Okay. They make good recommendations. Now, if you look, unfortunately, at some of the government agencies, especially local regional government agencies, it appears to me that they haven't been following the federal level recommendations. We've got one of our governments here in Georgia. I won't call their name because you guys probably already heard it on the news. Their internal county-wide government systems have now been hacked, and I mean locked down, bolted down 4 different times in the last 5 years. And the investigators are pretty darn sure that at least 3 of those times was by the same hackers and attackers. They just sort of rinsed and repeated their attack methodology and went right back and attacked them again, locked the systems down again. It was ransomware kind of things. Now, we don't know because they're not admitting it. They're not giving us the information out into the wild, whether they paid the ransom or not. But I'm thinking that it's because the same attacker group has attacked multiple times. They probably paid the ransom, and thought they'd go away. Well, it's just like any ransom situation. You pay the ransom, they're going to dive back in the pot one more time, you see. Now, here are, and I mentioned several of these organizations here before, the common vulnerabilities and exposures, the CVE details database. I gave you guys a link to that yesterday. There's the National Vulnerability Database, same type of information that you get there. Common weaknesses enumeration, along with these two guys here, CWE and the CVE, there's this common vulnerability scoring system. When we identify the vulnerabilities and the weaknesses inside of a particular environment in general, this gives us the ability here of actually prioritizing and, in essence, grading the vulnerability. And they base it upon about, I don't know, a handful, six or seven different metrics that they look at to see, for instance, how easily exploitable a certain vulnerability may happen to be. One of the metrics is, well, do you require any any supervisor level credentials in order to do it, or can just any Joe Blow off the street get to it? So with all of those metrics, it comes up with this score, in essence, for each and every vulnerability and the risks that are associated with those vulnerabilities. So those are all metrics that I can utilize when I'm doing the vulnerability assessment to gauge how easily exploitable a certain vulnerability that I've discovered may happen to be. And now another thing you have to understand too is what's referred to as the attack surface. Individual host machines, and it doesn't matter whether it is your old mobile phone here, your laptop, your tablets, your phablet devices, the unlocked door in the back of the building, all of those are considered attack vectors. And the combination of all of those attack vectors make up what we refer to as the attack surface of an organization. Each and every one of those attack vectors, remember, has some vulnerability and risk associated with it, just by nature of it being an entry point, either a physical entry point into the physical plant or a technology entry point, being able to gain access, unauthorized access to the network environment. Or maybe it's the swipe card reader and the weaknesses and vulnerabilities there. The security risk come when the hackers and attackers, I lovingly refer to as the thieves, thugs, and malcontents, when they are out there and they figure out where these vulnerabilities are. Okay. Now, the vulnerabilities, once again, may be involved with weaknesses in the configuration of a particular system. The vulnerabilities may be in poor configuration or poor setup of, for instance, the password management system. And it's a broad range of where those risks and vulnerabilities may apply in a network environment there. The trick to doing the full on, the very effective penetration test engagement is in identifying what those very high priority and high risk assets are, and then doing the probes that we talked about. For instance, the lab that you guys did last night, the probe that we did with the Nmap utility, probing into individual host machines and seeing the response back from the Nmap commands that you run against that. So that tells me very valuable things about what type of host machine that might happen to be. And I can, in the discovery scans, the enumeration scans that we talked about yesterday, I can find out things such as the physical configuration of the box, the hardware configuration, the software configuration, the versions of the operating systems that are running, services that happen to be running by evaluating the port scans, things like that. And then I take that information and I go to resources such as these here, and I figure out what are the known vulnerabilities on that particular configuration system. And for instance, I showed you yesterday in the CVE details database, I can even drill down to the nitty gritty of a particular vulnerability, and it will show me the software, the hardware, the operating system, or even a specific patch level that vulnerability was exploited with, how it was done, what the effect was on the systems. And all of these bits of information and data are free for the taking. It's open source, easily accessible information out on the trusty old worldwide interweb, you see. Now, some of the things that we will do at the end of these engagements, you all will remember, is I will try to wrap up the pen test engagement by making a whole host of recommendations. I talked about the end of life or the end of service types of systems. Now, in many cases, the top level recommendation would be, well, you need to replace those systems. But let me give you an example when that may or may not be possible. I've got a couple old boys, and one of them is older than me. So this guy's really older than dirt. But there were a couple of students of mine years and years and years ago. I'm talking about decades ago. I was doing programming classes for three large insurance and healthcare organizations up in Northeast United States. One of the companies up there had just spent, I'm talking about something like 28 to 30 million dollars in IBM hardware, mainframe hardware, a specific software system that was used for, it's called CICS, Customer Information Systems. And these two programmers were at the time employees of this company. And then after they semi-retired, they became consultants. They're the only game in town that knows these particular systems anymore. Okay. Everybody else has died off or left the country or whatever. But this company is still dependent upon those old, antiquated end of life and end of service systems. So if they have any issues with it whatsoever, they got to call one of these two guys. And they were telling me that they can go in there and charge whatever they want to. You know, one of them was I spoke with him. I don't know 6-8 months or so ago. Last time I talked with him, and even though he's older than me, he still refers to me as Mr. Donnie. He says, Mr. Donnie, I got these fellas. He said, I can tell them I want $350, $400, $500 an hour, and they got to pay it because there's nobody else that knows these systems there. So that's one thing that we may have to highly recommend, that these organizations actually roll out and replace these antiquated systems there. Now, if that's just not an option, okay, and understand these folks may still be amortizing out the almost $30 million that they spent on this stuff, because some of that, have to amortize that money out over decades. So sometimes it's just not practical to, all of a sudden pull the plug and replace the systems. So in that case, then the recommendations for those organizations would be, well, they got to wrap it up. They have to put some type of security wrappers around those systems to be able to further isolate and to secure those things. Okay. This is probably the most exploited configuration item here. It certainly is in the web-based environment. I gave you guys the link to the Open Web Application Security Project, OWASP.org. Their top 10 listing right at the top, default credentials, misconfiguration on credentials, not requiring a minimum, in my opinion, a minimum password should be no smaller than 8 characters. My preference is to start with 10 and go up from there. But other configurations like using secure protocols rather than non-secure. And I'm talking about everything. Your FTP, use that with a secure shell connection, okay, rather than just FTP. Telnet, don't use Telnet. It's not secure, never has, never will be, never going to be. Okay. The web protocols, HTTP as opposed to HTTPS. HTTPS is several different wrappers and layers of encapsulation and encryption rather than just doing the plain Jane HTTP clear text transmission of data. Also, I talked about yesterday in the recommendations for an organization, change the default configurations. Okay. Hardening the systems is what we call that. And things that we looked at, the routerpasswords.com. On your router gateway appliances, especially the wireless ones, you want to change those default user ID, administrator level user IDs and passwords. Okay. So don't just put those systems in place with their default configurations. The manufacturers don't know and are not concerned with your particular security setup. So we have to be concerned with that. And again, as a pen tester, that's the keys to the kingdom right there. That gives us open access to many, many systems, tertiary systems, downline systems, wireless systems, those dialing in from wireless locations there. I gave you the link to the Metasploit utility. Metasploit has all of those different libraries that we looked at yesterday of all of these different types of attack scripts, attack methods. Now, Metasploit, as I was telling you, it's written in a programming language called Ruby, which is sort of a departure from many of the other tool suites that are out there. Lots of those are written in Python, C derivative languages, JavaScript, Java, those kind of things. This one has an excellent collection of different types of exploits. They have exploits that are designed to attempt to attack the database engines, the file services, very specific email attack services. There are exploits that are available in their exploit library of scripts there. Now, Metasploit is a tool suite I'm telling you guys yesterday as well. It actually has 3 different flavors or 3 different versions of the tool suite. Inside of the Kali Linux distribution is the base level of the Metasploit engine. It does not, however, include, unless they've updated it within the last couple of weeks anyway, I haven't heard anything about it. It does not include the slick graphic user interface that the company Rapid7, who owns that suite of products now, has put together. So it's a Linux command line interface you have to drive it with. But if you have that Linux syntax understanding, you can get quite a bit out of the Metasploit tool suite. Okay. And services that we use on this, your web servers. For the most part, companies in general, especially on their public-facing websites, are using the Linux-based or Apache, Red Hat type of web servers. Now, I told you yesterday, too, a lot of companies that are internal putting up intranets, that kind of thing for internal services, and some of them doing external services. They're using the Microsoft web server, the MIIS server. Those have same sort of vulnerabilities. There are a pretty widespread variance, as it were, in different types of email and email services. Now, there's the 3 major protocols there: your simple mail transport protocol, the internet message access protocol, and the post office protocol. Metasploit has very specific scripts and attack methods for trying to go after each and every one of those. And you guys should remember, too, the simple mail transport protocol is what moves email messages from server to server to server. And then the other 2, IMAP4 and the POP3, is what pulls those emails down to an individual client host machine. So there's different attack methods and attack points that have to be concerned there with those. There's your file services, your primarily your FTP, file transfer protocol, and your server message block. If you'll remember from yesterday's discussion too, the server message block is defined to provide sharing services across different operating systems and even across different network configurations there. So some pretty good attack concepts there. If I'm able to jump from one network to another network, one system to a completely different system, that's some pretty interesting attacks on the server message block there. So, and then we have your remote access kind of stuff, your remote desktop protocol, RDP. There's a whole host of different remote connectivity pieces of software. Of course, there's the secure shell, which is in essence, the encrypted command line version. That's the one that is native to Unix and Linux environments, not native to Microsoft. You can run it with Microsoft, but you have to use client type programs. Like I use a client called PuTTY. You guys may be familiar with that. And it's a very secure type of environment. Okay. Now, there are lots of push now towards implementing encryption algorithms. These are some of the encryption algorithms that should be very common as far as the naming, but they are vulnerable. Most of these, let's see, yep. All of these. Yeah, every one of these, you can look out pretty quickly, locate some script code out on the World Wide Web that cracks these things open. They're low-level encryption algorithms. Now, a lot of these are being used now for hashing algorithms, creating message digest, which can indeed be a unique identifier for a file, for instance. But they're just not strong encryption algorithms for encrypting, especially large bulk data, and protecting it, securing it. Now, you have to understand too, uh, with enough computing power and time on your hands, any encryption algorithms can be cracked. Doesn't matter. Even the super duper ones that we hear about being included with things like Bitcoin and so on, with enough computing power and time. Now, some of them may take decades or 100 years to actually crack, but once again, with enough computing power and time, any of them can be cracked. Now, if we ever achieve, and I was having this conversation with a young fellow over this last weekend. He was asking me about, well, what's your thoughts on quantum computing? I doubt very seriously that in my lifetime, anyway, that I will see quantum computers come to the desktop. Some of you young whippersnappers out there may very well. When we get to quantum computing, all the rules change. Encryption will have no value at all unless they really, really change the whole encryption algorithms. Because what would take one of our classic computers today, 100 years to crack like the AES 256 encryption algorithm, well, a quantum computer could do it in a matter of seconds. So all the rules change at the quantum physics level there. But these are some of the algorithms that are still used again for certain types of functions, hashing algorithms, message digest. I use this guy here, the MD5. It's a variance on. It's called MD5 sum. Is a hashing algorithm that's used when I download some of my updates on a couple of my Linux distributions, the operating system and software that runs over it. So they'll run a hashing algorithm, the MD5 sum hashing algorithm on it before they send me the file and send me the hash. I run that same hashing algorithm and recreate that same digital hash. And that helps me to assure that that file has not been corrupted along the way. So some of these are still used for that kind of function there. But as far as encrypting and securing, large, critical, highly secure data, they're just not designed for that. There are other certain machines, and I have to probe these when I'm doing my vulnerability assessments and perhaps trying to do my full-blown pen testing exercise. And there's certain things that I do, for instance, with the Nmap utility or the Angry IP scanner and some of the other attack methods, especially ones that I find down in the exploit library and Metasploit. These are things that are put in place to front end systems by network engineers. Some of them are hardware, software components. Some of them are more frameworks and methodology approaches, as it were. But load balancers, load balancers are basically designed to stabilize network traffic and divvy it up among multiple backend systems rather than having one system that is getting the bulk and the load of any individual network connection. Some of the largest attack methods that we see out on any kind of networks of every shape and size, are these denial of service types of attacks, intended to crash systems, well, load balancers sort of divvies out that traffic, and think about 3 web servers or 5 web servers that are a high traffic website. Well, rather than having just one of them trying to handle all of the load of everybody trying to visit that site, put 3 or 4 or 5 in the background. Now they all have to be symmetrically linked so that changes on any one of them are immediately spread across the other servers as well. But a load balancer in front of those, by nature, of course, just does a round robin, first person server 1, then server 2, 3, and 4. That's the default configuration. So it does indeed balance that load among different network systems or network servers specifically. Now, firewalls, we all know firewalls. Firewalls are designed to basically process rules and filters and send every data frame or packet that is introduced into a particular network segment, and it has to pass muster. Most of your firewall systems, of course, are set up in that whitelisting or implicit deny mode. Just goes down the list. Allow this, allow this, allow this, allow this, but deny everything else, kind of thing. So it is a traffic control kind of thing, and these things often operate in concert with load balancers and proxy servers, things like that. Now, I've always been a big fan personally, as in doing network design, network engineering, security functionality. I want the biggest, baddest, 10-foot tall and bulletproof perimeter security you could ever imagine. I want the firewall, the intrusion detection or intrusion prevention system. I want the antivirus, anti-malware software kit. I want a proxy server doing additional if then else kind of evaluation of all the data frames. But I also want that same type of security apparatus rubber stamped on each and every host machine inside of a network. So those are some of the things that we would do as far as recommending those after we do a penetration test. Okay. Now, these guys here, the SIM system, Security Information Event Management Systems, and SOAR is more of a framework that excuse me, security orchestration is what we're talking about there, the framework there. The security orchestration assessment and reporting there. Excuse me, got a frog in my throat there. Sorry about that. Again, that SOAR is more of a framework and an approach. And underneath the SOAR banner are several different pieces, recommendations of hardware, software, markup languages, API definitions that pass information from one function to another, one system to another, that kind of thing. So security orchestration, access, and response there is what that is. Now, SIM system, pretty interesting devices there, software for the most part. But to give you a quick way that SIM systems work, and this should define it for you. First and foremost, SIM systems are capable of attaching to hundreds or thousands of pieces of endpoint event generation information steps there. SIM system can hook into, for instance, the login systems for a network. SIM systems can hook into card swipe readers in networks. They can hook into alarm systems or alert systems or monitor type of systems. They can hook in and look at, for instance, the vacation schedule for an organization. So any endpoint system that is capable of generating a date time stamped event of any sort can pretty much be tapped into these security information event management systems. And it's near real time as far as pushing that data as well. Let's say that Kevin works for an international corporation. The international corporation, the SIM system, triggered an event that said Kevin's user ID and password was used to log into a workstation this morning at 8:37 a.m. in Miami, Florida. No big deal. Maybe Kevin works out of the Miami, Florida office on a regular basis. But then the SIM system also captured an event that showed that Kevin's CAC, or his card swipe, was swiped in a card swipe reader at 8:39 a.m. Eastern Standard Time in Singapore. Now we got a problem. So 2 minutes apart, those things just don't make sense. Okay. So now we're thinking, well, somebody has either lifted or stolen Kevin's credentials or has made a copy of or stolen Kevin's swipe card. Let's extrapolate it on out. Let's now take a look at the vacation schedule. And it says, nope, Kevin's on vacation in Fiji for 3 weeks. Now we really got a problem. That's the capability of the SIM systems. Okay. It can give you that near real time evaluation of those hundreds or thousands of different event level triggers and run it through the filters, predefined filtering systems, rules, regs, and then send alerts, send alarms, send lawyers, guns, and money because it's hit the fan kind of thing. So that's some of the things that organizations put in place to strengthen their defense, as far as not just the networking access points, but the physical plant access points as well. Okay. Now, when we do an overall environment evaluation, when you analyze and assess the network itself, and those are the things that we find when we are doing the vulnerability and risk assessment there. Once you identify the valuable assets that are going to be your targets, those are your chosen targets. Well, then, like I say, you want to weaponize that information by selecting the appropriate tools, and then start probing that target, probing that environment, seeing if you can gain that unauthorized access, and then you go forward once you have made that target selection and gathered the tool suites that are needed to go after those valuable assets. Then you launch the attack. Okay, there's a couple of different ways to do it. You can decide to target a system remotely. You can decide to target a system locally. If you can gain access to a target system, and of course it's unauthorized access, by talking somebody out of or stealing credentials and gain physical access into the data center or to the office building, find a vacant workstation, use those local credentials to log into that host. Well, that then becomes what we call your pivot point. And I've talked about this a couple of times already as well. On that host machine that you have gained that unauthorized access to, now you start taking that logical look around. And on that tool, on that machine, you'll want to load Nmap, put the Nmap utility there. Run Nmap against any and all host machines that system can logically see throughout the network, and then begin to evaluate how those host machines are configured. And I'm doing all of this, for instance, inside the house. Okay. Now I can do those same sorts of things remote. If I can gain remote access, find a targeted port on a remote system. And basically what I have to have is the IP address or the full URL name of that computer system and an available link. So if I can say establish that telnet link, or that secure shell link, okay, or that server message block link. The server message block link would allow me to copy, if you will, a file, and it could certainly be a malicious file, onto that target system. So these are some of the tool suites and the names that they have on those in the Metasploit utility and Metasploit attack framework. Remote host, local host, remote ports, local ports, and then the server message block. Okay. Server message block will, more often than not, if the system is set up properly anyway, hopefully they aren't. But if they are, it will require a username and a password to attach to that system by way of the server message block links and connectivity. Now, inside of the Metasploit utility as well, there's also a function down inside there that contains these payloads. And I'm talking about that's malicious code. They have down there, it's called a Meterpreter database. And then inside that, and some of the other payload directories that are associated with Metasploit, are all of these predefined exploit code pieces. Okay. And I can launch those directly against a remote or a target local system there using a whole means of methods. I talked to you guys, told you about yesterday that, and I've called it a rat, actually over the last couple of days, remote access Trojan. That is one singular line of script code that sets up that reverse listener program is what it is. And if I know the IP address of that system, I just attack to that system on that particular communication port. And like I was telling you guys yesterday, I can have it do a number of things. Okay? I can have it attach me directly to the command line interface. I can have it attach me directly, if it's a Linux machine, to the password file or the shadow file or the configuration file in the etc directory on a Linux machine. Okay? So, I mean, there's a whole host of things that I can do once I gain that directory level and that direct connectivity access by just tapping into that script program that's doing that reverse listener on that individual communication port there. Okay. Now, always, and I've mentioned this, probably beating a dead horse here, but you can't stress enough the importance of documenting. That's again where I was talking about using the script languages and their comments internal there to completely document each and every, and I'm talking about each and every member on the attack team. And what I always did, I was talking about my stand-up meeting at the end of the day, I would always gather everybody's documentation. I preferred to do it digitally, not printed copies. And then that was all compiled together. I had a couple of documenters that would work and keep all of those documentation notes locally in a relational database. So at the end of the engagement, it made it very easy to massage that data, create reports from it, and have the same scripting programs, like I was saying, do the reverse of everything that they did and sort of cleanup. Because that cleanup step is very important as far as the engagement as well. And we always had a specific sign off document, and whomever the we called him our champion, we tried to get the CIO or the CEO or the EIEIO, no, whoever was our champion inside the organization, as well as the whoever their director of IT was, whether it was CIO, CISO, ISSO, again, didn't matter. Whoever was the leader of their IT division, we tried our best to require the sign off from both of them at the end of the engagement, where we would back out everything that we had done, show the proof that it all had been put back to rights the way it was before we went in there, and require both of those. Sometimes we'd only get one of the individuals to sign the dotted line and date it. Yep, you left everything as or better than you found it, kind of thing. So that was just a requirement of our rules of engagement and our business agreement with the client there. There are certain things that where you'll find these sometimes upline, sometimes downline dependencies on some of the things that we go after, some of the systems that we launch our attacks against. There is oftentimes a domino effect that is a result of attacking one system. If I crash it, well, what are the tertiary systems, both again, downline and upline from the one that I crashed, that may be affected as well? We also have to think about and consider for sure any external or internal stakeholders that may be affected by some of these things. Okay. So that's all got to be very clearly defined in the rules of engagement documentation as well. You have to know how all of the individual systems and components inside of a larger network may work together. Okay, so that is just something that has to be completely understood by the attacking organization. It's got to be all of it's got to be documented, because like I say, at the end of the engagement, you got to make sure you set everything back to the way it was prior to the engagement. And I was trained in at a very early age, and it's based on the time that I spent in the scouting program. We always tried to leave an environment much better than we found it. You know, so yeah, I always tried to use that same mentality when we were setting up and cleaning up after any of the engagements that we went into from the pen testing perspective there as well. So there are vulnerabilities that are downline and upline on any systems that you may launch attacks against. And I'm talking about software, hardware, configurations, network configurations, etc. Inside of the rules of engagement documentation, that's where all of the scoping for the entire engagement is done. That's where you identify, as I was saying, the systems that are in scope of the environment, of the engagement itself, to identify the systems that are completely out of scope for the engagement. And you also have to consider, and we talked about this yesterday specifically, any legal or regulatory compliance type of things that may indeed be affected by this particular engagement have to be clearly understood by everybody that is part of the engagement itself. If there are certain segments or subsegments even inside of a larger network configuration environment that are completely out of bounds, that are isolated and protected by the scoping of the engagement itself. Well, everybody on the team's got to be fully aware of that. Okay, and there are certain situations. It's all according to the type of enterprise that you're working with or for, and especially any legalities that may affect that organization. And I'm talking about regulatory compliance, audit functionality, access to certain types of data, that acronym data that I spoke about before. In some cases, the regulators will say, nope, I don't. These systems are completely offline, out of bounds. We don't want even the possibility of you stumbling onto or into that particular network segment as part of your pen test engagement there. Some cases, if you get the contractual agreements, written permission, as it were, to go after certain systems, as far as the pen testing goes, then you're cleared there. But you always have to understand the legalities and the responsibilities that may be involved with doing that type of engagement. Told you guys about the vendor that we had with my company that they didn't want to allow us to do the pen testing and push it into their particular environment. But it was absolutely a requirement for us to meet some of the regulations that we had to apply by. So I told them, I was going, look, this is a game stopper here. If you guys don't want to allow this, then we're going to have to find us another vendor. But, in the end, they capitulated. They actually allowed us to do what we had to do in order to complete the engagement. They signed the dotted line. They gave us a written permission that guaranteed that we could have access to those systems for sure. Okay. Now, again, I cannot stress too many times the importance, in my opinion, of learning the scripting languages. No doubt about it. We talked about several of these different scripting languages earlier. All of the scripting languages have the same type of a structure built into them. The ones that you will hear about more often are the shell editors, the bash shell editor in the Linux systems. In Unix systems, it's the same concept, but the shell editor there is called Born, B-O-R-N-E. Python is my choice of tool there now. It sort of goes across the board in all of these. You have the Windows command line interface, and then specifically Windows PowerShell editor. That's also incorporated in that. There's in the sys internals in Windows. There's the PS exec command line where you actually execute PowerShell commands there. Um, excuse me. But using scripts to automate the entire process, I'm a big fan of that. And, for me, it's sort of a personal thing too, because I'm dyslexic. That's one of my learning disabilities. And I was diagnosed with it ages ago. And it's just something that I struggle with on a very regular basis. I've even found, and some of my students have called it out before, if I don't sleep well, or if I'm tired, if I'm sick, I'll even find the dyslexia coming out when I'm speaking. I'll mix up words. I mean, I will mix up words badly. And it's very prevalent when I'm writing or reading, for instance. But especially in my old crusty age, it started rearing its ugly head in my speech pattern, especially when I'm tired or bothered about something. But scripting certainly helps me as far as doing the same thing the same way every time. And I'm just a big fan of working smarter, not harder. Any kind of tasks that is repetitive kind of tasks, if that all possible, I will script it. Period. The script languages do the same thing the same way every time you run the script. Okay. They never show up late for work. They don't have sick days. Um, and a script is something too that you can build over a period of time. I have one large Python script. I'm sorry, PHP script that I use in my web programming, and it's my error handling routine. And I have built this error handling routine over about the last 2.5 decades. Not quite about 2 decades, and I just plug it into any new web-based code that I want to run. I don't have to recreate the wheel. It's specific to the PHP web server programming language, and or more specifically to database error conditions that may be generated by a SQL database, specifically the MySQL database, which is an open source SQL database engine. But that one script code alone is about 350 lines of code, and I just include it in all of my new web programs there. And it does the same thing every time. It traps just about every conceivable error message you could ever come across in using creating a website. So I don't recreate the wheel every time, and this same thing in penetration testing. Okay, it's very efficient, very effective. It does the same thing every time. Now, PowerShell is the language that is baked into the Windows operating system. Okay, very high level, administrative level access. It is the file type is PS1. It is now being utilized in across the board in lots of different operating systems environments. It is now used and supported in the Azure cloud-based environment. And I've seen it actually now being utilized across the board in some other operating systems. So these are some of the tool suites that are out there that are largely based upon the Windows PowerShell command structure. PowerSploit, I've talked about that before. The Empire utility is another one that utilizes and interfaces almost directly with the Microsoft PowerShell based tools there. And let's see, yeah, three of these also have some other base level code, Python code specifically, but the majority of those are the PowerShell based tool suites there. Cool thing about PowerShell, and I mentioned this the other day, is you can create your own commandlets, and that's in essence a compiled almost PowerShell function. So it processes multiple PowerShell commands inside of the same commandlet, and it gives you the ability, much like we've had forever now in Linux, of creating your own commands. Okay? And it's administrative level stuff. And for most of the PowerShell commands, the PS exec sysinternals kind of commands, you'll have to have administrative access. So you'll have to know what the administrative password is. Bash is the primary scripting language. It's both in most Linux distributions as well as Mac OS. Mac OS is a Unix-based operating system. A lot of folks didn't realize that. But the Bash shell editor is much like command line interface. That Linux cheat sheet I gave you guys the other day gives you lots of the commands that are supported by just about all of the Linux distributions, because they all include the support for the Bash shell editor. And because of the fact that, as you guys know, Linux is a completely open source operating system environment, the Bash shell editor allows you the capability of creating your own commands. So there are literally thousands of individual commands that are publicly available, open source level commands that are all written in the Bash shell script. This file type is typically .sh is the file type for those scripts. There's old trusty Python. The file type on Python is .py, Python file type. The cool thing about Python is that it is operating system independent. It runs either as a interpreted script level language program, or for just about every environment, you can excuse me, you can get a compiler that will allow you to compile it into an executable that will run in just about every operating system, including Android. Android, Mac OS, Microsoft, almost all Linux distributions will support at least at the interpretive level of it. This tool here, this is a network packet crafting manipulation. Scapy is the name of the tool here. That's Python based, and it a lot of the same kind of things that we can do with, for instance, a couple of the resources inside the aircraft NG, creating packets and sending those packets across a network connection. Same sort of thing you can do with this. Capturing the network packets, changing the packet payload, and then sending it on down the line, capturing the packets, analyzing the packets. Much the same kind of thing that we do with Wireshark, for instance, or TCP dump, any of those kinds of packet collection type of systems. InPacket is another one. That's a whole collection of Python libraries and scripts that are there for doing all kinds of things from a pen testing perspective. Let me give you guys a link to the Scapy tool suite here. I think you'll like this. Now, on your exam, they're not going to get down under the covers on any of these things here, and ask you any bit level kind of questions on it. But it's good to have this in your toolbox, so to speak. The source code for Scapy you can get from the GitHub website. This is where the source code is. There's a link in your chat box there to that. This is real good information. It tells you what the Scapy tool does. Tells you, is largely written in Python, and gives you links there directly to the library set on GitHub, all of the source code, everything. So again, Python-based kind of stuff. Now, a couple of interesting things about Python. Python originally was written by, it was a Dutch developer, and his name was Claude von Husley or a husband, something. I don't remember what his last name is. But he originally wrote this as an engineering scientific kind of programming language, and it was for the company he was an employee of back then. And that was in the late 1980s. And I think he originally published the first publicly available version of Python in early 1990s. I started teaching. I earned a Python certification. I don't know, that had to have been 92, 93, something like that. And I wrote some code in it, got very familiar, comfortable with the language, and started teaching the programming language at actually a couple of different adult learning centers associated with university, one on the East Coast, one on the West Coast. So I've been working in and among the Python language for a long, long time now. And then there's been, for instance, JavaScript. Some of the first versions of JavaScript sort of grew out of that Python script level. And now, geez, just about every organization you can imagine on the planet is using Python as a large code base for many of their tool suites. So it's very popular language. Like I say, it goes across the board. And one thing I found interesting about it, lots of your programming languages and the source editors that are used in those, they will by default give you the indented source code, but those languages don't require it. Python does. The indentation of the Python is required by the language itself. So pretty interesting stuff. It has inline availability of inline help text. Um, very powerful language. Like I say, you can operate it as a interpretive script or as a compiled executable kind of program. Okay. The BAS stuff, breach and attack simulation there. There's several different, and I talked about already two of the platforms that actually support the breach and attack simulation stuff. The SIM systems and source systems. And those are more, SIM systems is typically software hardware orientation, and source systems is more of a framework and a platform guidelines, if you will. Here are some of the BAS-based platforms. Infection Money, this is the only monkey, this is the only one of these I've ever used personally. I have read a bunch about Atomic Red Team and Caldera. Let me give you the link to the Infection Money tool suite. You might find this interesting as well. Darcy Blues. Yeah, this is completely open source. Okay, I love the graphics there. All of the source code you can get from GitHub, the same thing. And it seems like some of this may be available on SourceForge too. I've had to check that. I know it's available on GitHub. I love this utility. I'm gonna run part of this for you right quick here, so you can see what's going on here. I think you'll like this. It has a really good way of associating systems and the information that you gather from other packages as well, and then sort of feed it into Infection Monkey, and it will build a very cool looking map for you that shows you the affiliate types of links and associations of systems inside a particular network segment, that kind of thing. So check that out. Let me give you this link here. Check that out, and I think you'll find it interesting. Now, again, same thing. They're not going to ask you any detailed questions about this on your certification exam. This is just one of the other suites of products that are available out there that integrate with lots of other tool suites. And the SOAR framework there sort of gives you information about that integration. But there again, they'll want you to know, Atomic Red Team, well, it's a base platform. It's your breach and attack simulation platform. Caldera, same thing. Infection Monkey. But that's about as deep as they actually get as far as asking questions about these things on your certification exam. Okay. All right. So that is this particular module here. That's the information that we wanted to go over here. Wanted to make sure we covered that. For the most part, actually the secondary step that you'll go through in this environment is assisting in gathering identifying what the potential targets may be inside of the network you are going after. You have to prioritize the targets based upon the real or perceived value. You want to target the high value targets for sure, but you want to make certain, as I was saying, that everything that you are targeting and going after is indeed defined as being within scope of the particular environment. So every team member has to be fully aware of the scoping, the rules of engagement documentation, to make certain that you don't color outside the lines, and perhaps can be held civilly or criminally liable for coloring outside the lines. So everybody has to be fully aware of that. Okay. All right, gents, if you would be so kind, I want you to navigate over. Is that there? Nope. That would be there. I want you to navigate over here to your learning platform. Now, any of you folks that are joining us on YouTube at this point in time, you'll not be able to participate in this next section here. What we do is at the end of each of the lessons, when we do the documentation or do the lecture portion here, we go through and at the end of it, they will take a module quiz. Now there are lesson reviews. Those are typically five, 6, 7, 8 questions. The module quiz here at the end of this, only 10 questions total. So what we're going to do right now is the class members are going to take this module quiz. And remember, gents, I want you all to make sure that you post your scores online in the chat box here and be proud of those scores. And remember, it's all good news. Doesn't matter if you do poorly or you think you're doing poorly on it. Own it. And again, it's all good news. You know what you know what you need to work on. So we're going to do that, post your scores, and we're going to go ahead and take your quick first morning break. Okay. That'll give you all the time to do that quick latrine break and to maybe refill that coffee or juice cup. I'm going to set your timer here up for, let's do 15 minutes ought to do it, I would say. Well, no, wait a minute. You got 10 questions. Yeah, we better do 20 minutes here on that. That I think will give you plenty of time to do the quiz, post the scores, and then grab that refill or latrine break, and then we will be right back here and jump on into our well, we got a lab exercise we're going to go through later on. We're going to probably come right on back here shortly and dive on into at least the beginnings of our next lesson. But we've got a performance-based question that I'm going to have you guys go through as a team, maybe even two. We'll see. So go ahead and do these quizzes, post that score, and we will be back at it here shortly. All right. Good luck on that and enjoy yourselves. All righty, folks, getting ready here to re-engage. Very well done on that. Looks like you guys were looking over each other's shoulder there on that quiz. Everybody across the board, 80%. Okay, that's pretty cool there. So very well done there. And now I want to encourage you guys as well. On all of these quizzes, I want to encourage you to repeat those things multiple times. That's how it actually drives home the information that is being covered in the quizzes themselves. Okay, so that repetition is the trick there. All right, let's look at here. Let's pull this down and open up the next presentation here. And then I'm going to look at we've got at least one performance-based question and perhaps two that we're going to work through here as a team. So let me pull that up, move that over out of the way here. Want to welcome any and all guests that may be looking at us out there on the YouTube channel there. And I see, let's see, we got everybody. Yeah, everybody in class there. Excellent job, folks. Anybody on the YouTube channel that may be looking in there, if you have any questions, just push those to one of the reps there at CED Solutions, and we'll try our best to address those. Okay. Now, right now, I want to go over here and look at our outline here. There's the lab. We'll actually go over and let you guys get some of that lab time together later on this afternoon, perhaps. But I want to look at there it is. That activity there is the performance-based question we're all going to look at here as a team. So that would be right there. Okay. Now, I told you guys on your certification exam, you will get right out of the gate. I mean, right out of the chute when you hit the go button on this exam. You will start with 4, maybe 5 of these performance-based questions. Okay. They are scenario-based. The same thing as we did yesterday. I want you guys actually to participate in this. Again, you can turn your mics on if you want for your replies, or you can type it in the chat box, whichever you feel comfortable with. So here is the scenario. You're a security consultant for an outsourced cybersecurity company that consults with clients to run penetration tests of their clients' web servers. The client is working to get cybersecurity insurance, but the insurance company requires the client to run periodic tests on their systems. The client has customer-facing web servers that they primarily use to manage their clients' finances. As this information is extremely sensitive, they want to ensure there are no vulnerabilities that a malicious actor can exploit. Your company has selected Metasploit as the framework for running your penetration test of the client's web servers. One of your colleagues attempted to run a test, but ran into an issue where the penetration test failed to target some servers. You must resolve your colleague's issue to continue the penetration test. You are reviewing 2 web servers' Metasploit screens and need to determine which were successful and how to correct the ones that were not. All web servers run on Linux and have a PHP-based website, my favorite programming language now. Server 1 information, the IP address 192.168.13.5. And the port number that is where the exploit is being attempted is 12.535. Server 2 information, IP address 192.168.13.6. And its specific port number 11.231. And the Metasploit machine here, IP address 104.18.35.29, and its port number is 12.573. Now remember, as on here, as well as on when you take this exam online, you will be able to display or to close down these scenario instructions at will. So if you need to revisit those, you can always bring them back up. Okay. Also, on your exam, when you're taking this, if you go through and get part of the way through the configuration and need to reset everything, they'll have an option there where you can clear everything and reset it back to what it was. Okay. So here is server one. Okay. MSF exploit. There's the web delivery and it says show options. Here is the result of that. Exploit, and this is the directory path to the specific script. Exploit multi-script, and the web underscore delivery is the script. And the payload options are as follows. It's PHP programming language, and it, in this case, is the interpreter reverse TCP. So the current setting here is your local host is 192.168.1.5. It is required. And the local port you're talking to is 11.231, also required. Okay. Interpreter session is not valid and will be closed. Okay. So if I run that test there with that Metasploit command, what will the result of that test be? It will not target server one. It will target server one. It will target server two, and the exploit will not be successful. Which one of those is valid? Okay. And by the way, you guys can pull this same PBQ up on your screens there if you want to go into your learning platform. Okay, Jacob says the exploit will not be successful. Does anyone concur with that? All right, we're going to go with that. Absolutely. And then, will the module work with the client's servers? It is the wrong module. It will not be successful. It will not work with the client servers. It will work with the client servers. What do you think? Don't be shy. Somebody take a shot because we're going to see the answer. We're going to see the correct answers there
Donnie, would you
at
mind
the end of
scrolling
this.
back up to the test real quick, please?
Yes,
Thank you.
sir. There you go. Okay. And Chris says, well, it will work. So it says it will work. It's the wrong module. It will not be successful. It will not work with the client servers, or it will work with the client servers. Chris says, okay, all right, we're going to go with both of you guys. Say it will work. All right. Next over here, let's take a peek. Server number two. I'm going to go ahead and check off all these bad boys here as well. Okay. Server number two, MSF exploit multi handler. And the command is show the options. Okay. Module options here, MSF core, exploit is the directory path, PowerShell. Okay. Interpreter underscore reverse underscore TCP. And the name is, the current setting is 192.168.13.6. Required, yes. The local port is 11.231. Required, yes. The exploit is exploit multi-handler is a directory path, or exploit multi is a directory path, and the handler is the exploit. And then it says the result of that is interpreter session one opened, and it is from 192.168.13.6 on port 12535 targeted towards 104.18.35.29 on port 12573. So once again, what will the result be of the test above? Okay. It will not target server 2. It will target server 1. It will target server 2. The exploit will be successful. What do you think? Right. It will target server 2, Chris says. What do you guys? All right. Everybody's in agreement there. It will target server 2. And will the module work with the client servers? It is the right module. It will be successful. It will not work with the client servers. It will work with the client servers. Okay. And Kevin says it will work. What do you guys think? All right. Now, as I've told you before, the great thing about these guys here, well, there's two great things. One, when we hit the finish button, it will show us immediately what you got wrong, what you got right. Okay. And then you also can redo these things as many times as you wish. So, boom, there is the correct and incorrect answers. And I pulled the plug. I messed up on these things here. I didn't let you guys answer those. My bad. So that one's on me. But there again, the exploit will not be successful is incorrect, it says, and it will work with the client servers also incorrect. The really great news, there is the correct answers. It tells you the what, where, when, why, how, and who of why it is correct or why those things are not correct. Okay. The Metasploit localhost and local port are incorrect for the exploit attempt on server 1. That's where we really should have brought the scenario back up to see what those designations were. Okay. The local host should be 192.168.13.5 and the local port should be 12.5.35. Okay. As the local host and local port configurations are incorrect, the Metasploit could target a machine correctly, but it will not be server 1. Since the server runs PHP, the module selected would be correct for server 1. Okay. So it tells you all of the correct answers for all the options there. And again, my bad on these here. I did not let you guys select those and see which one of those should have been selected for the particular execution there. Okay. So again, get back, do it all over again. Okay. That's the great thing about these is that repetition there is absolutely available for all of these. And you should do those again and again and again. Okay. That repetition really is what drives this stuff home for you. Okay. Now we're going to absolutely take opportunity later on this afternoon for you guys to go through this scripting lab. And then one of the other labs here, this guy up here, okay, I'm going to have you guys do that as part of your homework. That uses the responder utility that we talked about in passing earlier. So you guys will be doing that as part of your homework there as well. Okay. So well done, everyone, except for your instructor. I pulled the trigger on those check boxes too quickly. My fault. So I'll take the hit on that one. All right. Any questions before we go ahead and dive on into this thing with our next lecture portion? Now, I mentioned to you guys a couple of times yesterday, the most organizations now are at the very least beginning to experiment, certainly, with utilizing web-based technologies internally inside of their organizations. So now you have the same technologies, the same platform, the same frameworks that are being utilized for all three of the particular app type of environments that enterprises are actually setting up. You have the internet, the public facing internet is is one of those. They use the SQL database backend engine, the scripting language, and I notice here in these exercises they talk about the PHP programming language as well. That's my favorite now as far as writing any kind of web-based application code. I use the MySQL database engine, also an open source database engine. And then, of course, on the front end, as far as the client goes, the only client you have to have is a valid web browser. Okay. So they'll do that on the public facing internet. They also are using those same technologies for the internal facing intranet application servers, whatever product, service says they're providing to the internal employees. They're also using the same web technologies. In addition to those two, they're oftentimes setting up this area that's referred to by a couple of colorful names. It is a protected subnet or an extranet or the DMZ, the demilitarized zone. And what they're doing is setting up, again, a web server of sorts, same technologies, but it is limited access. For instance, if I have, say, external organizations that are managing my building automation systems or my fire suppression systems or any type of environmental control systems, that kind of thing, they still communicate as part of my screen subnet, they call it, that portion of my network, but they're not allowed any further into the rest of my corporate network. Oftentimes we'll set up in that DMZ area there what's called jump servers, and those jump servers are very specific towards controlling very particular types of systems. Okay, but they're not available to the public at large, and they are not available to any of my internal employees for the most part. So that screen subnet DMZ area, but all of those three different implementations are still using the web-based technologies. Web-based attacks, and I told you guys earlier about the Open Web Application Security Project, OWASP. Web-based attacks have been in their top 10 of their most often used attacks on systems for 10, 12 years. And for the longest time, it was number one. It was right at the top, command injection specifically. Now, there are a couple of particular types of attacks that you will encounter as far as websites. And a couple of these are ones that when I've been involved in either as a project leader or as a team member doing pen testing, man, we go after the websites right out of the gate. Okay. I want to first try my best to see if I can crash the website by just force feeding just this most unorthodox gathering of data into any input capable fields, or trying to exploit vulnerabilities in the URL, the web address itself, going from page to page to page during the same session. Trying to force feed the access into, for instance, the root directories of a website. It's called directory traversal. I'll show you some examples of that later on as well. There's two very specific types of web-based attacks that you will hear about a lot. There's one called cross-site scripting, and it's this guy right here is how it's noted. Cross-site scripting attacks. That actually incorporates an HTML tag, set of tags called the script tag. The script tag is actually it's actually executed by the browser. So most of the HTML that is generated to display a format, the display of a website, is sort of passive types of tags. The tags actually define things such as the constraints of an input capable field. You have beginning tag and an ending tag. And then within the middle, it defines, well, this is an input field. It is 8 characters long, and it's looking for this particular types of data. So for every field that you would find defined on a web form, you'll have HTML tags that define the constraints and the characteristics of that field. Well, there's also this other set of tags that we see here. It's called a script tag. Anytime a web browser encounters a script tag, whatever is between the beginning and the ending script tag is executed by the web browser. This cross-site scripting it's a multi-phased attack, of course. Users will find vulnerable websites, or the thieves, thugs, and malcontents will find vulnerable websites, and they will accomplish embedding some of this script coded tag strings and then having it embedded in the backend database. Well, then everybody that goes to that site after they've embedded that code, that script code is then fed back to their browser and it's executed. More often than not, what is between the script tags is a redirect, an HTTP command that redirects to an alternate website. So here's the way that those usually work. I will use a tool. I gave you guys the link to the tool HTTrack yesterday. It allows me to lift all of the code and the definition off, basically copy a website, copy all the code, copy all the images, copy all the directory path, everything. Lift that code up and put it on an alternate server. I will, register some bogus domain there that I can use and house that web server. So then if I can then compromise a website that the user is used to visiting, say I make a copy of their, I don't know, their bank site or their credit card site or whatever site they visit to purchase products and services from, doesn't matter. Lift all that code, create my bogus malicious site, embed that website that they're visiting regularly with this script code, so that the next time they go to the site, that script code comes back and is embedded into their browser, and immediately they're redirected to the malicious site. If that site looks and acts and feels just like the one that they thought they originally visited, they don't check the URL. They don't really notice that, and because the redirect happens so rapidly, they don't notice it happening there. So they're redirected to that site, and I'll put up some kind of pop-up message or something or there may be an issue with the security on your visit here. Please rekey your user ID and password. So they may just hand me over their user ID and password that I can then use to log into the legitimate site, okay, called cross-site scripting. Now, there's another version of that. Well, it's a different attack altogether. It's called a cross-site request forgery, also a multifaceted attack. Talk about that later on down the line. If I can gain access to a host site, a web server type of site, there's all kind of things that I can do to further the attack on those individual sites there. Okay. Now we're going to take a look at several different types of attacks that are mostly launched against web servers that attempt to exploit certain vulnerabilities that may be based upon misconfigured websites, misconfigured web servers, programmers not having the time, effort, and resource put into the design of the site to actually trap these types of air conditions or specific types of attacks on the websites. Okay, there are a whole host of different types of attacks on websites. Many of them are targeted towards the web server application. I was telling you guys, if I'm doing a pen test against a company and they have a public-facing website, I'll browse that website, gather as much reconnaissance information as I possibly can about the enterprise, the organization as a whole, and perhaps even some of the individuals, especially the directorate level and above, and find out, contact information for them, names, addresses, email addresses, phone numbers, etc. And then I'll just tuck that information away and perhaps use that later on for certain other types of attacks. There are things that I can attempt to do to crash a website, for instance. If a website has any input capable fields, I'll try my best just to brute force overload those fields with every inconceivable collection of just bogus data I can, cramming it into those fields. See how well the programmers did their job. Okay. You know, if they've got a field that's looking for, I don't know, a login field for outside customers, and it's looking for a user ID. Well, you know, most user IDs on that stuff is typically either an email address or, you know, a specifically defined username. So the limits on those should be enforced by the application program to only a certain amount of characters. I want to see if I can overload that sucker with just, you know, 1,000 characters in a singular field, or 150, 250 characters in a singular field, just to see how the web application actually handles that. Now, if I am successful in blowing up that field and crashing that site, it is typically a result of what's referred to as a buffer overflow. Now, you have to have a little bit of an understanding of how of how especially web applications work. When you start up a web application, let's say I've got a web form and I'm looking for a 8-character customer number, 25-character first name, 25-character last name, city, state, zip, all that sort. Well, in my programming language, I will typically go through a step right when I first start the program up. I'll call it object allocation, because you understand everything runs in main memory, or a slice of main memory on these servers. So I will go ahead and allocate reserved space in main memory for 8 characters for the customer number, 25 for the last name, 25 the first name. And usually those spaces are allocated, you know, just a series type. Here's 8 characters, there's 9 through whatever, you know, just allocating that space in main memory, and it's, you know, it's concurrent spaces. So if I am then able to cram in, let's say, 150 characters into that 8-character customer number field, well, it'll go ahead and put the first 8 characters that in that field, but it overflows everything in the other adjacent fields. But then when I try to do things like, oh, I'm putting more data in that field, the last name, first name field, so on, it may very well cause what's called a buffer overflow. I have overflowed the reserved space, and especially if I'm cramming data in there that's not compatible with the allocated space in main memory. So it may crash the program. It certainly more often than not will throw an error to the program. It'll raise an error. So that also is dependent upon if the programmer is not trapping that error properly. Then it crashes the application program. Thus, the web server. Then here's the important part: if I can crash that application, that web server basically gives away the store. It may tell me all types of information about how the server is configured, directory paths. If, like many web programmers do, rather than communicating directly with the application programming interface that allows them to validate credentials, for instance, against a directory service of some sort, they'll just give everybody, you know, as long as they validate the user ID and the password in the website, they give them administrative level access to the back end database. And those credentials may very well be hard coded in the back end server code, because they just can't imagine that server code would ever be displayed out to the, you know, to the user in the browser level. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. But if they make those types of programming and configuration mistakes, I will try my best to capitalize those and then to use that misconfiguration or the lack of proper error handling to further my attack, you see. So I try my best to crash that website in every way I can think of to do that. There are the command insertion. I may try to include SQL commands in those input capable fields, or as part of the parameter value pairs that are passed as part of the web URL, the web address, from one page to another page to another page. There's all kind of weaknesses I can force there. Okay. So, and that's just some of the web application kind of attacks that I can try my best to force feed. All types of credential, you know, figuring out, or brute force types of attacks, just throwing every conceivable password with every user ID. Now, those types of password cracking types of attacks there, either the brute force, the dictionary attacks, or the rainbow table attacks, those are ones that are much more difficult to do nowadays because most savvy web um, uh, network engineers and web programmers, they're timing the client out after, say, 3 invalid login attempts, that kind of thing. So those are much more difficult to pull off than they were in past lives, so to speak. But I talked about the directory traversal attacks, being able to position myself in a web server up to the root directory, for instance. I'll show you some examples of how that's done. Hijacking sessions altogether, that's that cross-site request forgery kind of attack. Stealing cookie files. You guys are familiar with a cookie file. A cookie is just a validated credential, a little file that's sent back down to the user's browser. Well, if I can gain access to that browser by way of the code, I may be able to steal that cookie and hijack that session like right now. Okay. So these are just some of the web-based application level attacks that are all too often very, very successful. Okay. The command insertion is not just limited to either by just SQL, structured query language, which that's my first attempt at attack, because more often than not, websites have some type of SQL database engine on the backside there. I'll try to gain access to that as well. Here is an excellent suite of products. I haven't given you guys the link to this as of yet, but the Burp Suite. Burp Suite is a set of tools that is specifically designed towards cracking websites. Okay. Let me back up here. This one here, I think, is a little bit better here. This is your, the Portswigger is the name of the organization that actually houses this. The Burp Suite is another one of those that has a couple of different versions of their product. And there's a very low level free. It's sort of a free download and try it, and then purchase the product later on kind of environment. But it's a great little product there. And again, specifically oriented towards hacking, cracking, and attacking websites in general. Okay. Gave you guys the link to that product suite in your chat box as well. And it includes all of these same types of attacks: the command injection, the cookie stealing. But in essence, it acts as a proxy and intercepts traffic going to and from client and the web server to the client kind of thing. The OWASP organization, they have an attack suite of products called ZAP, Zed Attack Proxy. Now, theirs is truly open source, okay? Zed Attack Proxy is what they call that. And it is a complete suite of attack products. They give you all the source code, give you all of this stuff wrapped up. This is, again, completely open source, free for the download. It is excellent attack methodology, all wrapped up into that. And it acts sort of like a web proxy attack server as well, much like the Burp Suite. But they've got some additional attack code in there as well. And remember, I told you about the OWASP top 10 security risk. Right at the top of that list is broken configuration, weak access, credentials, and so on. And I think now down some, I think we looked at it, what, the day before yesterday or yesterday? The command injection now, I think in 2025 is now moved to number 3. For the last couple of years, it was down at number 4 and 5. For the first 10 years or so of them publishing this, it was number 1. Command injection, and specifically SQL command injection, even though there are several other software protocols including the LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, the DNS, DHCP, email protocols, your IMAP4, your POP3, simple network management protocol. Almost all of those, including XML, for instance, has a query type of request reply type of function baked into those. You just have to know what the syntax is. Now imagine being able to jump in through a web field or through the web URL, the web address, and issue an LDAP query command that allows me to jump into the directory and pull information out of that directory based upon stolen credentials. And if I can, for instance, steal the credentials for the administrator, that's the keys to the kingdom to the directory services in a particular environment. Okay. Here are just several of these we've looked at already before. Some of the tool suites that are utilized for web application attacks. We looked at Burp Suite. We saw Truffle Hog yesterday. I just gave you the link to the OWASP Zap Z-Attack proxy there. WP Scan, that's an interesting tool. There is a web development type of environment it's sort of a drag and drop kind of environment for non-web programmers, but it gives them the ability of very rapidly creating websites. And there are lots of security vulnerabilities in those particular sites. WP Scan is what allows me to do launch some very, very targeted web attacks on that. There's your GoBuster, Dirbuster. We looked at Dirbuster actually yesterday. There are a handful of attack frameworks that are available specifically oriented towards SQL command injection. Not sure how familiar you guys are with SQL structured query language, but most of your, enterprise level anyway, websites have a SQL database engine on the back end. And I've seen some really large enterprise level websites that are using, Microsoft Access SQL database on the back end. Very powerful SQL database. A lot of people think, oh, it's a little desktop product. Oh, contraire. It is very, very powerful website, a website strength database. But that SQL, the MySQL, the MS SQL, the Oracle SQL database engine, those are all very, very powerful SQL, enterprise level database engines, and they're all susceptible to these same SQL types of attacks. There's the brute force stuff I was talking about. That is usually more along the lines of password cracking types of packages. There are a half a dozen or so password cracking packages. There's one very common, what's called John the Ripper, which it will do either of the different password types of attacks, the brute forcing, the dictionary level attack, the rainbow table attack. There is one that's called Cain. Now, it used to be called Cain and Abel, but it's just Cain now. Also, it will allow, multifaceted kind of password cracking attacks. The thing about those is, as I was saying earlier, they are, because network engineers, security practitioners, etc., have really begun to get a handle on, locking the workstation down after 3 or 5 invalid login attempts. Those aren't nearly as effective, but we have found that the ne'er-do-wells, the thieves, thugs, and malcontents are gaining access to systems, even domain servers, and stealing the password database engines or database tables, and then taking them offline and doing their cracking there. Right. So, but online, real-time, inline brute force attacks are not nearly as effective as they have been in previous iterations of systems. GoBuster, Dirbuster, those are brute force attacking tools, really more designed on directory services, attacking directory services, not specifically towards password-based stuff, but brute forcing directory, even doing the directory traversal attack that I was talking about earlier. Now, this concept here of collisions, that's pretty interesting. A data collision occurs, and you guys probably know this. Anytime I'm using these very weak hashing algorithms, because they generate a shorter output, there are less available combinations. Say you got an 8-character output that a hashing algorithm takes whatever the size file comes in, but it generates this fixed length 8-character output. Well, in an 8-character output, there are several trillion possibilities that it could be. But a computer program can spin through that in, a matter of hours and sometimes brute force the hash. The data collision occurs when you have two separate different files that generate with the hashing algorithm the same digital signature, in essence, the same hash. Okay. And then that same kind of thing becomes what they refer to as deterministic. Now, the longer the hash that's generated with these more sophisticated hashing algorithms, then the possibility of two separate files generate the same hash, it's just one in an astronomical number of possibilities. So it's just never going to happen. Okay. Some of these older hashing functions, though, SHA1, 2, and or 3, MD5, RC4, RC5. Some of those older hashing algorithms do result in these data collisions. Okay. So you want to stay away from those things if at all possible, because they may or may not generate a unique hash or identifier for input capable files. Okay. So here is some of the directory traversal stuff I was talking about. And there's a couple of clever ways that they try to mask this. If you're down, say you're looking at a Windows command line interface, and you run a directory command, and you find yourself 3, 4, 5 different directories deep or subdirectories deep in your path. Well, if I want to back up a single directory in the Windows world, I just type CD, change directory, ... backs me up one directory. If I want to back up 3, it's CD ... /... boom, 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 backs me up 3 directory paths, right? They do the same thing trying to issue these directory traversal attacks, and they'll do it right as part of the URL on a web page, or as part of the input capable field data in a web page. And the hope is that by doing that traversal, then my pointer ends up at the root directory in the web server itself. And then, if I can do that traversal back up to the root directory, for instance, in a Windows box, guess what lives at the root directory? Well, the command executable lives at the root directory. If I'm doing that directory traversal in a Linux machine, and I can, position myself into the etc directory, there's all kind of cool stuff that lives there. Any of you cats that are familiar with Linux, you'll understand what I'm talking about. That's the password file, the shadow file, the configuration file. All of that may very well be exposed in that root directory. Now, one thing that they'll do, and I'll give you guys another link to these percent encoding things. Rather than hard coding the directory traversal values, they will encode it so that it sort of fools or bypasses whatever the programmer's sanitation or data scrubbing might happen to be on that web URL. Here is you'll love this. For every character that is on the keyboard, let's see, the W3 schools, there's Cisco. Let me better this. W3 schools, that's the same link that I gave you the other day for the there it is, for the Python and the SQL tutorials. Here's this. For every character on the keyboard, there is a percent encoding, they call it Unicode, a value that will represent the physical characteristics on the keyboard, every character on the keyboard. Digits, uppercase, lowercase, special characters, etc. They've got their percent encoding counterparts. Okay. So rather than just encoding the dot dot dash dot dot dash dot dot dash config dot, or command dot exe on the as part of the attribute value pairs on the URL, they'll hide that stuff using the encoded characters. It's actually %2e, %2e, %2f is dot dot dash. Okay. All right, there's %2e dot dot %2f dash. Now, if the programmer, the web programmer, is doing their job properly, then they'll sanitize that stuff out. But many of them think along the lines, and here is the link to that cheat sheet, by the way. Many of the web programmers think along the lines, well, I just need to look for the hard-coded dot dot dash characters there and then scrub that stuff out, not thinking that they should also look for their percent encoded values. So that's how I've been able to so many times in the past sneak this stuff past the air trapping routines that they've built into their web sanitation or their field scrubbing routines there. Okay. So that's what allows me to hide that directory traversal stuff there. That gives me the ability of setting my cursor and my pointer into their system right back up to their root directory or their parent directory, backup line there. Now, here's what I was telling you about the cross-site request forgery. You can also do server-side request forgery, which allows me to basically make calls or forces the server by some command insertion that I do there to run some kind of process or service on the server. Okay. Now, cross-site request forgery, pretty interesting. Again, I told you, multifaceted attack. Think about this. Maybe I'm using a tool like Wireshark to actually view a communication session among a user and whatever site there I see them visiting regularly. Okay. So let's say I've been watching Susie over the last couple of weeks. I've seen Susie visit this same website to purchase products for whatever it might have to be, school supplies, doesn't matter. Well, I am observing Susie there. I've captured information off of the interaction with the Wireshark type tool. I have done some investigation on Susie. I know what her email address is, things like that. Know the company she works for, that kind of thing. So now I I have used like the HT Track software suite. I've copied all the code off the website that Susie's visiting every other day, buying product from. I've set up my own bogus web server. So now I see Susie is hitting that website. Well, I send a sideline email with the company's graphic banner embedded in the email. And I say something along the lines of, well, Mrs. Susie, Miss Susie, I noticed you have just logged into our website. There may be a security problem with the configuration. Click this link so that we can validate your credentials. Well, Susie sees it. She's thinking, yeah, I'm on the site right now. There's the branding. It's got to be legit. She doesn't check where it came from. It's legit as far as she's concerned. So she clicks the link. I do a couple of things. First, I download a little piece of script code that runs in her browser, by the way, that allows me to steal that cookie. That cookie is her validated credentials into that site. Okay. So she logs in with her credentials. The site creates the validated encrypted cookie, sends it back down and embeds it in a very specific location in her browser cache. So when she clicks on the link that I provided her to validate her credentials, first thing that happens is it steals that cookie, gives it to me. I then establish a connection to that website, present that cookie, and it says, oh, okay, that's another. Susie just contacted us again. Don't ask for credentials because there's the cookie, right? But so I've hijacked that session right then. But I have also redirected Susie now to my bogus website that I've designed to look, act, and feel just like the legitimate site that she thinks she's still talking to. And I prompt her for her credentials. So not only have I hijacked the session she thought she was in, and now I'm talking to the site and it thinks I'm Susie, I redirect her to my bogus site, and then she gives me her credentials to the site. So whatever I, decide to do during the hijack session now, I can log back into that site a couple of days, a couple of weeks later, and carry on my dastardly deeds. You see, called cross-site request forgery. So it's sort of enticing, and in some cases even forcing the user to do things that they either they don't realize they're doing, okay, for the most part, and to give me information that they don't realize they're giving me. Okay? That's just another means of sort of an enhanced and extended version of social engineering there, if you look at it in that sense. Okay. So either of those, cross-site request forgery, server-side request forgery, in essence, launching things either by way of the user's help or by just calling things on the server directly there. Okay. Now, when I am talking to an access point of any kind, when you're communicating with an access point of any kind, there are certain types of things that I can do, manipulating data, taking whatever, an object, a file, a directory, a image, anything, and they call it serializing, turning that into some type of data object format that I can then restore into the original object format later on down the line. Okay. I can take whatever the object, turn it into data, exfil it out of a network, and then run some type of process over that data and then transform it back into the object that I wanted it to be, and then say run a program. I think about the process that's used nowadays, where I embed one object into another object. Okay, like embed one file inside of another file, and then exfil that file, and then have software on the other side there that extracts that file out of the embedded file, and I can use it whatever I want to use with it. Okay. So deserialization is what they call that type of attack there. I can do things such as extract information or extract an object, a file, a folder, a directory, whatever, turn it into some type of data format, even included in like an alternate data stream where it's actually an executable file. It looks like a text file. Okay. So exfil it out of a network, reverse the process, turn it back into whatever object type that I viewed there. And then say if it's a malicious software, some kind of malware, execute it, run it. Okay. So that can cause all types of attacks on systems. It can, infect systems with malware without firewalls and intrusion detection systems and proxies realizing that it is malware because it is embedded, for instance, inside of another file or turned into like an alternate data stream where it looks like just a non-dangerous type of file. And then I have, like, say, some process on the other end, wherever I'm sending it to, wherever I'm embedding it, that turns it back into that attack type object and then executes it. Okay. There's also different versions of that I see with other application software pieces. Okay, that can be used to do that same kind of thing. Turn one file into a different looking type of file, send it off somewhere, deserialize it, and then turn it back into the original type file and execute it as an executable type of program. Here's some of the injection types of attacks that I was talking about earlier. The SQL Interactive, you guys will actually do a real cool lab exercise using the SQL interactive function. Not really sure how much you guys know about SQL. I want to show you one little thing here that may sort of surprise you as to how simple it may happen to be. SQL, the structured query language, is, I mean, even though there are many more functions than what I'm going to tell you about, there are 4 basic SQL functions that we utilize to communicate with back-end database engines. There's the select statement, and that extracts information from a file. There is an insert statement that allows me to insert a new record into a database table. There is the update statement, which allows me to change an existing database record. And then there's a delete statement that allows me to, just like it says, delete or remove an existing record in a database table. Okay. Now let me show you how simple it is to extract information out of a SQL table. One line of code. Okay. Now that looks like a pretty mundane statement, right? And it is indeed. This translates to select all of the fields. That's a wildcard, the asterisk there. It says select all of the fields from a table called CUSTDB, where the customer number field is equal to null, and that's just 2 tick marks. There's no blank space in between them. Or, and that should be an equals mark there. Sorry about that. Or 1 equals 1. Now that statement right there will always resolve out to being true because 1 equals 1. And I use the OR operator. So it's based upon either this is true or this is true. And this is always true. Okay. Now, a couple of caveats. I would have to have predetermined by some method that there was indeed a table in that database called CUSDB, and that within that table, CUS_DB, there's a field called CUS number, CUSTNO. If either of those is logically false, then the whole statement would fail. Okay. Now, how can I find out that information? Remember, I was talking about crashing the web server? And the web server itself giving me all this detailed information, it may very well give me that level of data. Okay. I may be able to crash the server and look at some of the code that's running in the background, and it may tell me that information. Okay. I may be able to do a scan against the SQL web server itself and find out some of that information. It's all according to how the code may or may not be exposed because of weak implementation of the web server code, the database engine on the back end, etc. Or I may have been able to belly up to the bar when the programmers were having their every other Wednesday meeting and session down at the bar, and gleaned this information from one of the programmers that had one too many, right? So again, you got to be cautious with the ethic boundaries there. But if I do that statement, if I can successfully issue that one statement into a database backend, the next thing I see in my browser is a row and column listing with column headings of all of that, every field in that customer DB table. And I just scroll through it with scroll bars on my browser. Okay. That is cool. The first time I was ever successful in doing that, I jumped up and did a happy dance. Okay. Because of the coolness factor. That is SQL injection there. it looks for and exploits the weaknesses in the way that the SQL engine itself may not be properly protected, and most certainly the web application code on the background, revealing those vulnerabilities and allowing those to be exploited as well. I think you guys will really enjoy the SQL interactive lab exercise you're going to be doing here later on. But as I was telling you earlier, SQL is not the only language that I can use to inject in through web servers or websites. Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, it has a query language. XML, it has a query language. DHCP, DNS, the Simple Network Management Protocol, your email protocols, as I was saying earlier, all of those support some type of query syntax. You just have to know what the query syntax happens to be, and then experiment with it, either by way of the input capable fields on the website, or the command line interface, or the web URL. Many of those give me that ability to try to force feed those SQL statements on the backside. Okay, very cool, very cool. There are also things that I can utilize. I talked about the cross-site scripting there, using the script-based languages. Let me give you an example of how that might look too. Okay, let's see here. Let's move on down here. A couple of statements. Yeah, the cross-site scripting, it begins with the HTML script tags. Beginning tag, and let's just say and then it ends up with the ending script tag. Now, if I encountered this particular statement here in my browser, the browser would immediately redirect to whatever site that I have here. And I just pulled that one out of the hat there. Go to bad site. Whatever alternate site I have set up. Now, again, the caveat is I would have to have previously found some way to embed this script here, that full string, in a database field in the backend database. So there I would use the insert statement, okay, and either insert an entirely new database record with its own unique identifier, or use the update statement just to change the value of one field in a database record. And that database record is utilized to formulate and create HTML that formats data on a web page, outputs that data. Okay, so I would format that data and send this script information back as that field value. Well, because it's in the script tag, when the web page actually reads that, it immediately executes it, and you get redirected to the bogus site. Okay. So, and it's quick. I mean, you never even see it coming. And if the site that they get redirected to, if I've been clever and created that site with all the same look and feel of the legitimate site, all same branding, logos, same look and feel, I can pretty much lead them to do whatever I want them to on that bogus site. So-called cross-site scripting. Very clever approach. And again, none of these things are easy. They are simple by design, but you have to do the prerequisite steps in order to set the whole attack up. So it may take some time. Okay. So, and that's just part of the injection there that I can do. Now, these things here, this indirect object reference there, it allows me to change, and the first attack that I would want to change is the uniform resource locator, the web address, or some of the attribute parameter value pairs that are passed as part of that URL, and manipulate that information. And what I'm doing there is redirecting whatever page they're calling with additional information. Okay. The parameter value may be a SQL interactive statement. The parameter value may be that script embed statement. I want you to take that script and embed it into the field called customer name, whatever, so that when somebody hits that customer record later on down the line, it redirects to the alternate page there. Okay. I talked about the cookie manipulation there, in stealing the cookie from the web cache and hijacking the session. Okay, so all of those are means that I can utilize to try to grab information from these websites and redirect or manipulate the user into either divulging information they wouldn't normally divulge or in acting in ways that they wouldn't normally act. But it's just me, generating the information that leads them down that path. That's yet another means of social engineering there as well. Hacking the human. See, the session hijacking there, that's, I either talk a user out of or steal credentials that allows me to gain unauthorized access using somebody else's credentials. Okay? Or the thing I was talking about, that session hijacking, stealing the cookie. Now the server or the site thinks I'm the person that originally started the session. You have to understand too, the total reason for the cookie object. Websites by nature are not what is considered stateful. They're not intelligent enough to know that every link that you make to a different page on that site or attempted connectivity, if it's a site that requires login credentials, they don't know that the next page you visit is not your initial entry into the website. So that's what the cookie is all about there. Most of the sites have what is referred to as a default or an index page, which is the entry point into the site. If that index page is what is prompting you for your credentials, then the web server code on the back side says, okay, I validate these credentials, create this cookie, send the cookie back down to the browser so that the next link they make during this same session, if they send that cookie along, I realize they've already been validated. Okay. I don't have to prompt them for their credentials again. So that's what the cookie's all about there in that situation, to alert the website to, okay, I don't have to keep prompting them for their credentials. This is not their first entry into the site. Okay. So if I steal that cookie, I hijack that session right off the bat. The tools we looked at there earlier, the Z attack proxy and the Burp Suite, both of those have built-in scripts for doing all of these things. The stealing the cookie, hijacking the session, storing that cookie, replaying that session later on down the line. Now, the replay thing is something that is much more difficult to do nowadays. For the longest time, and you guys probably remember this, in past lives, a lot of these websites, once you validated originally to the site, you didn't ever have to validate ever again because those cookies were fixed. They were stored in your web browser. And unless you cleared the web cache, which most people didn't do that, when you go back to that site, it sent that cookie along. It's going, okay, we know you. Now that same sort of thing is typically accomplished by your password management components there, many of which are also built into the modern web browsers too. So, but then now the cookies that are the session level cookies, most of those are killed. They're expired when that particular session ends. Okay. So either the credentials are automatically presented to the site by way of your password manager, which most of those are encrypted anyway, or you have to relog into the site the next time around and create that new cookie. Because most of, like I say, most of the web programmers and site managers now become savvy on, don't just leave those cookies out there valid from now on. Either revalidate it with the presentation of the credentials with the user or the presentation of the credentials with their password manager. But every time it recreates that cookie. So that cookie is short-lived. can't use an old cookie to to hijack a future session because it's a different cookie. Okay, different identifiers there. Now, here's something that I tell you, as being a program and project manager over the years, has always just driven me crazy, crazy. All too often, when programmers make updates or changes to application code, rather than taking that code out, putting it into a sister type of file that documents the changes, date and time stamp. Here's the old code that we took out. Here's the pointer to the area in the program source code that we replaced it with. Here's the reason why, all that kind of stuff. They'll just do a branch around some of this code. They don't deactivate the code. They don't comment it out. They just do a branch around. Well, if I find those branches around, or if I suspect, again, by just getting information out of programmers when I belly up to the bar at their every other week meeting, realize that they're just branching around this old code. Well, I'll try to crack into that code so that maybe even I can execute that old code. Some of that old code, evidently, there was problems with it because they replaced it with something, okay, called arbitrary code execution there. And that's exploiting the weaknesses and the poor design that results in the vulnerabilities of the application programs. It also, those vulnerabilities also sometimes exist at the hardware level, and that's more along the lines of the operating system updates, feature function updates, that kind of thing that we encounter with that level of code. Now, more often than not, especially operating system level code, you don't have access to the source code. So it's much more difficult to track that kind of stuff down anyway. But in customized code, companies that write their own customized software, those are the types of attacks that I will try to launch. Again, those ACE types of attacks, the arbitrary code execution attacks there. All types of, I've talked about the buffer overflow. There's another overflow type of attack. It's called an integer overflow. For instance, if application program code is designed to have an algorithm that creates the sum or an output of some function, algebraic function, that creates, let's say, a 7-digit with 2 decimal position output field. Well, the buffer space in that memory there is set up to contain a 7-digit 2 decimal position field. Well, if I can jump in and change that code or force feed the algorithm to generate a 15-digit 5 decimal position field, well, it blows up the space that's allocated to hold that calculation. It's called an integer overflow. It's exceeded the limit of the space that was allocated to that. Very similar to the buffer overflow. Okay. There's also things that I can do jumping into the middle of code execution and inject, malicious code to be executed as part of the software. And I really mess up what they call the program stack. In any application program, they will, the system, it doesn't load the whole program up in main, it typically doesn't load the whole program in main memory. But even if it does, it arranges the executable pieces of that basically top to bottom in what's called a program stack. So it will execute this line of, and typically at that level, it's machine assembly level or machine level code. It executes that. If that creates some variable that affects how the next line is executed, it will populate the variable and then execute the next code, which reads the variable, and so on and so on and so on. Well, if I interrupt the logical flow of the commands that are located in that program stack, and if I do sort of a jump ahead and try to execute a line of code that's further down the stack, especially if it is dependent upon the successful execution of previous lines of code, well, I have interrupted that whole program stack. That's actually called a race condition, where I jump ahead in the logical order that code is structured to execute in, and try to execute a module down the line that is dependent on previously defined modules execution, blows it up. Those are all overflow kinds of code execution issues that I will attempt absolutely in not just web code, but any server kind of code. Okay, so that the serialization, deserialization types of attacks, the releasing of malware. I looked at your local host and remote host types of attacks. This is similar in concept, except that this is including files, adding files to a stack or a program as it's executing, malicious files typically. And I can do it either locally or remote. If I'm logging in, taking control of a system from a remote attachment, a telnet or an FTP, and I can force feed a file and load it into a file stack on the target system, and it's a malicious file. Well, I can cause all kinds of crazy things to happen there. Okay. There are most of your, especially web-based programs, they provide the capability, and like I was telling you guys with my error trapping routine that I've built over the last couple of decades, all of it, JavaScript, the PHP programming language, Python, almost all of those code snippets includes a specific statement that is insert or include. So you can include an external code set or collection into a new script without having to recode it inside that script. So it takes external, includes it, or inserts it in there. You can do the same thing by including or inserting those code snippets into an existing script or program that's running. And whatever malicious activity you got going on in that file will be injected, as it were, into that executing program. Okay. So first you have to find out where the insertion or include points may happen to be, and then insert the malicious file inside of that, either locally or remote. If I can attach to a system, like I was saying, with a telnet or even a secure shell connection, and review the code that's running on that system in a web server, for instance, and then I find those include or insertion points. Okay. Like, so in my situation, I would overlay the error trapping file that I use normally with a bogus file, and then the system, when it runs, it automatically includes that, and whatever I've got in the bogus file that I overlaid is inserted there and executed. Okay. So yet again, another couple of, in my opinion, very clever types of insertion or inclusion types of attacks. Same thing as a SQL inclusion or SQL insertion. Okay. I'm inserting malicious, bogus code into an existing file process or an existing program process there to be executed by the running systems there. Okay. Now, and we'll go ahead and wrap this up here real shortly. Let me look at something right quick here. Okay, this is going to be right on time here. Between different program control pieces or between different functions, even within the same program, we have these messaging conduits, they call it. They call them application programming interfaces, APIs. And they are like a messaging channel or tunnel, if you will, that allows me to pass information, data, parameters, attributes from one program to another program, from one function to another function. So the API acts as that conduit, which allows me to pass the information between those. There are a couple of very common, well-known application programming interfaces. SOAP is one of those. It's a simple object access protocol, SOAP. There is XML, your remote procedural call that is used with XML and XSS types of systems. The RESTful API that's representational state transfer. That is an API that gives me status or state information update between different application programs. There's another JSON, JavaScript object notation, Java Web Tokens. There are several different APIs that are available out there, and very commonly used to transfer information from one application to another application. Okay. If I jump in the middle of those APIs, and probably the one that you guys are most familiar with is the URL API that's used on web pages. I know you guys have seen it. If you're on a website and you click a button that goes to the next page in that website, a menu item or just a button, doesn't matter. Oftentimes, up as part of the URL, you'll see that it is taking information that you put in or that you selected on the primary page and putting it into attribute value pairs at the end of the URL and passing that to the next page you're telling it to go to. Okay? That's an API. That API there gives you the attribute value pairs, and you can pass, it's up to like 256 different fields of data on one singular URL call. The very first attribute or parameter that's passed on a URL is preceded with a question mark. That's the very first one. Then you have whatever the name, the name equals whatever. And every other parameter that's passed after that is preceded with an ampersand. Very first one, question mark, all the rest of them with an ampersand. So it's the name equals whatever value. That's where I can jump into that API between web pages and put in whatever I want to in those parameter values. That's where I might sneak in a SQL injection. That's where I might sneak in that directory traversal function there and even hide it using the percent encoding technique. Okay. So that's, the injection attacks there, messing around with the parameters, tampering with those parameters. That is the type of API abuse that I can perform there to monkey around with the data that's being passed back and forth between individual programs or between functions within the same program as well. Also, I have seen programmers that, again, I was telling you earlier, they did not communicate with the directory services on the systems. They just hard-coded values and passed those values as part of the URL attribute value pair string. Crazy stuff. Putting in the user ID and the password and passing it as a parameter on the URL. Just, I guess, hoping people won't notice that. That's kind of things that I look for as a hacker and attacker. Now, me personally, on the websites that I've programmed, and I was just fortunate, my mentor, when I first started writing web programs, this was his gig. You don't expose any parameters as part of that URL. Anything that you want to pass from one web page to another web page inside the same server, you hide it in a form field. So it's not exposed as part of that URL. It's additional programming for sure, but the security value you get out of that is head and shoulders above passing as parameters. But as a pen tester, I look for those parameter values in that URL because it's amazing how much stuff may very well be exposed there. Okay. Java Web Tokens is a means of passing information basically across the internet using the JSON scripting, the JavaScript object notation scripting. Okay. There are vulnerabilities there, and oftentimes people expose the data that they are passing, much like the same attribute parameter value pairs that are patched on a website itself. Usually the Java Web Tokens is scripting that is packaged up inside of a JSON script. And it's name value pairs, just a little bit different syntax than doing it as the parameter values on the URL. Okay. But either way, if I intercept those scripts, I can see exactly what the name and the value pairs are there. Now, if the Java Web Tokens are being sent using the HTTPS protocol, different thing. You can still read the data, but it's encrypted. You may not, you can't make sense of what it actually is. Okay. So I can manipulate that. I can manipulate Java Web Tokens to do the directory traversal kind of things, all of the above. Okay. All right, I am going to pause the web or the YouTube function right now. Let me jump over here and stop that right now. Hold on.